Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first panel session of this year's Festival of Monsters. Yay! Yeah, come on. I'm very happy to see you all, and I am very excited to introduce our panel this morning, which is called Cannibalism and Deviance. So I'm going to introduce all four of our speakers. They are going to each talk for about 15 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. Our first speaker today is Panda Kroll. Panda earned her MFA in Media Studies at Northern Illinois University and a JD at Boston University. In addition to her law practice, she teaches biotechnology law and ethics at Cal State University, Channel Islands. I didn't know you did that. That's very cool. Our second speaker today is Kevin Volkan. Kevin is a professor of psychology at Cal State University, Channel Islands. He also currently serves as a senior adjunct professor of clinical psychology at Cal Lutheran University and as an adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. His most recent book, Human Aggression, War and Genocide, The Psychological Roots of Violence, was published in 2025. That sounds light and easy. Congratulations on that. Our third speaker is Avalon Manley, who is a doctoral candidate at Indiana University of Pennsylvania and whose studies center on horror, monstrosity, and queerness. They work as a high school librarian and undergraduate instructor in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Manley's most recent publication appears this fall in Queer Identities in Popular Culture from 2010, that was published by the McFarland Press. Congratulations on that. An upcoming publication, this is an amazing title, You Cannot Kill Me in a Way That Matters, Liminality, Mushrooms, and the Transformative Uncanny of Fungal Horror, will appear in the Handbook of Body Horror in 2026. And our final speaker this morning is Kyle William Bishop, who is a third-generation professor at Southern Utah University, where he teaches courses in U.S. literature, film studies, horror cinema, adaptation, and cultural studies. He is a foundational zombie studies scholar, which I feel is an aspirational title that we should all work towards. Doesn't matter, we give ourselves our own titles. And he's published extensively, including American Zombie Gothic and How Zombies Conquered Popular Culture. So I'm going to turn things over to Panda, and we can get started.
All right, are you ready for some scandal? Hollywood. So we have a diversity of cannibals represented at this conference. We have fictional cannibals, we have real cannibals, and then we have alleged cannibals. Alleged cannibal Armie Hammer is the subject of my presentation today. When I heard that the theme of this conference was cannibals, I immediately thought I need to do a deep dive into this because he starred in one of my favorite films and maybe one of yours. Let's find out. So Call Me By Your Name is the other film. Maybe that's yours. Mine is On the Basis of Sex, which was my heroine as an attorney. I think all women and many genders believe that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a, luminary, is a, rest in peace, although things could have gone differently at the end. But so here she is in a photo with our hero or anti-hero, 6'5", towering over her. She's known for being diminutive, but he is really tall. And there's Armie Hammer at his peak. And hard to feel really sorry for him given the privilege that he was born into, but he suffered. And I guess a theme of my talk today, let me start this timer so I make sure I don't over talk, is that we are all perpetrators, victims, and witnesses, right? So we need to find some space in our heart for obviously the victims and the perpetrators, but what about us, the witnesses? Because are we not consuming these scandals? Are we not amplifying them? So Mr. Hammer here has a family. He has 2 small children, 7-year-old Ford and 10-year-old, starts with an H. And, you know, they're the collateral damage of cancellation. And his, you know, he made his own bed, but that doesn't mean we can't find in our heart to have, you know, some compassion. So you saw the rise, and then the fall was pretty sudden. He had a slow rise. It took him about 10 years to become, you know, really at the top of his game. With some of those films won a lot of awards. And let me go back to the last slide really quickly. He actually, ironically, won a Women Film Critics Circle Award for gender equality for this Ruth Bader Ginsburg treatment on the basis of sex. Really a lovely film. Didn't do great financially because they put $20 million into it. Call Me by Your Name, in contrast, they only put $3 million into it, and it made about the same amount of money. It was really well received. And ironically, after Call Me by Your Name was aired, there was another film by the same director, Luca, I think it's Guadagnino, which I'll show a slide from, which was about cannibals, a cannibal romance. So what happened? Well, you saw the rise, the fall. So there's leaked DMs. I'll show you those in a minute. And they suggest violent fantasies, cannibalism, rope tying. Several women came forward and said they had very toxic relationships, on again, off again, really horrific kinds of relationships with him while he was supposedly separated from his wife, only she didn't know that they were separated. So she dropped him like a hot potato after these came out, and he was ultimately accused of sexual assault and emotional abuse. He admitted to emotional abuse, but said all the relationships were consensual. So these are unproven, uncharged allegations, but if you hear these women talk, they're pretty compelling. But he was dropped by his talent agency and publicist, and American Express sued him, and he now pays $1,500 a month in child support to his wife, which, considering how much money he was making at the top of his career, to me suggests he's not doing too great financially, so maybe his family cut him off, I don't know. So he moved to the Cayman Islands and rumored to sell timeshares, and if you thought that was the lowest you can get, no, because he also has a podcast. In a bizarre coincidence, apropos of nothing in researching this, his co-star for Call Me by Your Name, Timothée Chalamet, went on to make, with the same director, a Bones and All in 2022, which is a cannibal romance. So in 2022, to pile on, Discovery Plus did a, I think, 3-part docuseries featuring his accusers. 2 of them were interviewed. The other one was furious that they made, you know, entertainment out of her pain, and she did not agree to be interviewed, the one that had prompted the DA scandal. And so with that, I don't have this in here, but basically they found his aunt had written a book called Surviving My Birthright, because it, I guess, sucks to be the great-granddaughter of the richest man in America and have a toxic family history. And then, so this was, I said, an example of media amplification in modern public shaming. So it turns out Arm & Hammer brand is not really, like, Arm & Hammer was on the board and he had a controlling interest, but they predated him. Anyway, I like this slide, this picture, so I put it up. But there's these are allegations. So we could argue he is, because these women said, here are his DMs. You will see them in a minute. Why? Because one of the survivors of the alleged abuse made an NFT and auctioned it. It's a DM, you'll see in a minute. So was he or wasn't he? So I think you can read these. So these are the DMs that are alleged that he wrote. I need to drink your blood. I'm 100% a cannibal. But he denies it, and he says, "Are you kidding?" And he says, "You know, come on, like, I'm just have my kink, and this is just talk, and I didn't say it anyway." Okay, so what is this? What was he into supposedly? He went on the Stephen Colbert show and showed him how he likes to tie knots. So he definitely likes rope play, but I don't know if he likes erotic rope play. That's what the DM says he likes. And so I just wanted to give you some vocabulary. Vorophilia is the erotic desire to be consumed or to consume another. And this, I wonder if this hyperlink works, and if I go there, if I can come back. I'm kind of afraid to do it. But anyway, if you click on this hyperlink, it goes to TripAdvisor that says you can go to the Cayman Islands, and some guy named Ben will give you for $300 a lesson on how to get tied up. And so I wanted to just spend a minute on, this is kind of the cancellation is our modern version of shaming. So we have, everybody heard about the kiss cam, right? And now those, it's like these people didn't expect to become viral, to go viral. Shame fades in days, but Google lasts forever, or, your browser history. So, and then of course, Scarlet Letter was one of, I said, the original cancellation. Shame is no longer temporary, it's archived. Here we go. I think this is fascinating, and I had no idea about this until I started researching these slides to make you slides today. So Julia Morrison is one of the women who agreed to be interviewed about her toxic relationship, which I think we describe now. I was doing some research on Cassie in the Diddy trial, and the judge would not allow her lawyer to talk about this 12-year relationship, which she described as coercive control. And the judge said, that's too confusing. It is confusing. Yes, coercive control, right? So that is essentially what these women who had these on-again, off-again relationships with Armie Hammer said, is that yes, we kept seeing him after bad things happened, but we were under his, spell of power. And so here's, I don't know if you could read them, but these are the DMs that were leaked that caused him to be dropped. And even more, me, and I'm basically Caligula. So she calls this, Julia Morrison calls this the Caligula triptych of DMs. So can she be redeemed? So I have a book, it's in my purse, but it's, my brother who's a Hollywood producer said, you gotta read this. So apparently this happens. You get on a plane, and by the time you land, you realize some tweet that you did in a lapse of judgment has gone viral and you've lost your job. So this does happen. So what do you do? What should Armie Hammer do? So he followed the playbook. He talked to, who's the Iron Man guy? Robert Downey Jr., who's famous. So everybody loves a comeback, and maybe it just takes time. Louis C.K., if you didn't hear, was performing in Saudi Arabia as some of our favorite comedians. Trevor Noah was a big surprise. Whitney Cummings, you want to look at, it's beyond the scope of this talk, but you want to look at Whitney Cummings, who spoke who presented in Riyadh, what she says about being a comedian and accepting an invitation to go to a authoritarian, brutal regime. So these are all, different takes on cancellation. Conclusion. Okay, so cancel culture functions as a public ritual of purification. The offender becomes a scapegoat for collective guilt. We do a pile-on, right? Because we're witnesses. Are we making things worse for the betrayed wife, ex-wife now, of Armie Hammer and his 2 kids by amplifying his scandal? Are we voyeurs? Are we the cannibals? So these are just questions to consider. And then I did want to at least bring up, in the 36 seconds I have remaining, that there's a dissonance, there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs when we love a performer and they become persona non grata. They get canceled, right? We want to like them. We used to like Woody Allen films, and now we don't watch them. We won't go to them, right? And this is, I think, creates some kind of a dissonance for us. It's moral ambivalence. Because I did love the love story on the basis of sex and the partnership between Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her husband, Marty Ginsburg, who actually gave her the tax case that she argued before the United States Supreme Court to overturn hundreds of laws that, including that women were not allowed to have credit cards without their husband co-signing, and we owed a great debt to her. So do we consume scandal to cleanse our own impulses? And then who decides? Louis C.K. was, he admitted everything. He said, I did all those things that the women accused him of, and he was canceled for years. He came back and did a modest show, and now he just got, a big award for his most recent stand-up, so maybe he has come back. And then he spoke at Riyadh, so we'll see how the comedy festival in Saudi Arabia ended 1 week ago. So we're still seeing the fallout of that, whether those comedians like Trevor Noah and who else, Pete Davidson, and some women, Whitney Cummings, was she the only woman? I think a lesbian comedian went as well. And some of them said, oops, I wish I hadn't done it. And others said, I'll do what I want. And that's all for that. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and thank you, Renee, for the nice biography. I'd like to add to my biography that I am a proud graduate of UCSC. So I am a UCSC slug for life. And I'm going to talk today about cannibalism, a little bit about psychoanalysis and culture, and I have way more slides than I could possibly get to. And I will say that I have a 3-hour-ish, 2.5-hour-ish lecture that is up on YouTube. If anybody's interested and wants to see the whole thing and really get into the details about the different kinds of cannibalism, you can email me and I'll send you a link to it, or you can search for it. It's up on YouTube. So I've been very interested in cannibals for a while. And I want to just go briefly talk a bit about kinds of cannibalism, because we can divide cannibalism to a couple of different types, and there's probably more than these out there, but these are the main ones that I've been thinking about. Endo-cannibalism is where people actually eat members of their own group, and usually this is related to funerary rites, eating some of the relatives who've passed on in order to incorporate them into your body and into the mind. Exo-cannibalism is eating outsiders. That's usually enemies, usually tied to warfare or humiliation. And the idea is you absorb the power and the skill of your enemies, but you also humiliate them by eating them and then excreting them, basically turning them into shit. Okay. And then survival cannibalism, this is something that is not very common nowadays, but back in the days of sailing ships, when we didn't have instant communications and phone networks and satellites and everything, people would get lost at sea, or they would get somewhere and they wouldn't have anything to eat except for people. And I'll give you some cases of those in a minute. Sorry, why is this not going forward? Come on. I am having trouble here. Let's see, I did use the arrow key. Oh, there we go, okay. Wait a minute. So psychotic autocannibalism, this is people who generally have some sort of psychosis, will eat parts of themselves, and they'll also maybe eat other people. And the case study of this is Jeffrey Dahmer, the murderer. And there's other examples of that as well. And religious symbolic cannibalism, where cannibalism is a lot of times in ritualized forms in religions like Christianity, where you eat the body of Christ in the Eucharist. And then there's other religious symbolic cannibalism where it's not, or religious cannibalism where it's not so symbolic. And then one I didn't really know a lot about until recently is medical cannibalism, that there's a whole kind of fad, I think in the 1800s, 1700s, of eating mummies. Pieces of mummies had some medicinal value, and people would try to get body parts of mummies and eat them. So those are just a few, and you could probably think of other ones as well. A lot of cannibalism in the animal world, very, very common. Mantids, arachnids, spiders, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, lots of versions of this. I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but just know this is a very common thing in the animal kingdom. Archaeology, early humans, we think that some early humans like Neanderthals may have consumed each other, but the evidence for this comes from scratches on bones and things like that they draw a lot of conclusions from. to be a little bit careful about this. There's also taphonomic signatures. Taphonomic is stuff that has to do with funeral rites and things like that, and some idea that maybe that was related to cannibalism. We have to be very careful about projecting the idea of cannibalism onto either our ancestors or onto other groups of people that are maybe not part of, modern, first world countries, because it's a way to justify colonization. To say, oh, those people are cannibals, we need to go in and convert them to, whatever religion and take them over and colonize them because it's for their own good, because they're eating each other. So that's been used throughout history to vilify groups, and so we want to be very careful about that. Lots of cannibalism in Greek mythology. And again, I won't go into the details about this. Kronos, of course, swallowed his children to prevent the succession. So if you've watched the TV show Succession, that's like a modern version, a little bit of the Kronos myth. If you want to try to be generous with your imagination. This is the famous painting by Goya, which is inaccurate because Kronos actually supposedly swallowed his children whole. And then the last child was going to be Zeus, but mom wraps him up wraps a rock up and gives it to him. He swallows it whole. Zeus stays out and eventually overthrows Kronos, and his siblings emerge, and they become the Olympian gods and goddesses. Okay. And there's all sorts of other interesting myths here. A couple of them are really interesting, that these revenge myths, where you take somebody's kid, you chop them up, cook them up, serve it to them as a meal. And interesting enough, probably the most latest cultural version of that would probably be Game of Thrones. I think what's the young girl's name who trains as an assassin, goes where the guy who did the Red Wedding and goes but serves him up his own children first and then kills him. She's a badass. So, and other ones here. The one I'm most interested in is the Dionysian Maenads, where the Maenads were worshippers of Dionysus who lived these very chaste, pure lives. But then they would drink and go into a Dionysian frenzy, and any man walking around would be rendered limb from limb, and they would eat especially one body part, which you might think about. And again, as a good Freudian, I probably don't need to mention what that is, but I will say, here's a quote I will give a shameless plug that if you're interested in this, you may read my early book, where I talk about drug addiction, and Dionysian rites are kind of a symbolic representation of drug addiction. And this book is available for free, which is nice. It's up on the internet now. If you go to freepsychotherapiebooks.org, you can search my name, you'll find it there for free. So anyway, that's all right. Survival cannibalism. Those of us who grew up in California all know about the Donner Party. When we were kids, we were a little obsessed with this, and I think in high school, my buddies and I drove up to where the Donner Party were, up in the up near the Nevada border, and camped out there. And so that's something implanted in the California mindset, at least back in my generation. The Andes Flight 571, where people crashed in the Andes and then ate their dead compatriots. And then the very famous case of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. This is where sailors killed the cabin boy. They were shipwrecked. They were in a lifeboat. They killed the cabin boy, and then they got back to England, and then they were brought under trial for murder. But because it was the law of the ocean, where this has been long in the thing, the sailors would whoever draw the short straw would be killed, and the other ones would survive. And they were convicted, but they were basically convicted but given like a day's sentence or something, a very light thing, and let go. Okay. So again, depending on the moral institution and the legal principles, there's a lot of divergence about survival cannibalism. And again, we don't have much of it today because we have instantaneous communication, so it's very rare nowadays. Okay. Again, some religious stuff. The Aztecs had a kind of a form of cannibalism, but it was very ritual. And a lot of people thought they were cannibals. The original thought was the Aztecs consume people for nourishment. They didn't have enough protein. That's kind of been debunked. And really what they would do is they would sacrifice people, cut up little parts and send it to people almost as like a status symbol. Oh, I got a little piece of meat from the rulers, and that's a status thing. So different kind of thing. The Aghoris in India, they're a sect of sadhus Hindu sadhus, and they would go and eat meat, human flesh from the funeral pyres. And again, that would be an idea of trying to, embrace non-duality, not to have, liking things, not to put things into dualism. And then again, I mentioned the Christian Eucharist already. Okay. And again, you can read Levi Strauss, the raw and the cooks. The cook, the ritual cooks the raw violence of killing or eating somebody into meaning, into some kind of symbolic connection to the sacred. Okay, and I'm in auto-cannibalism again. And again, I mentioned this comic book, My Friend Dahmer. This was written by a guy named Durf, who grew up with Dahmer, went to high school with him. And you can read about his early life. It's very interesting. All right, and then I'm going to mention Freud. Freud wrote a book, Totem and Taboo, where he has this what is essentially a fantasy about primitive people. It's not actually, there's really no evidence that this is a real thing of primitive people. Freud has this fantasy, it's very interesting, that you have this band of brothers and they have this omnipotent, controlling father who monopolizes all the women, controls all the women in the tribe. And again, the brothers kind of get sick of this, and the father's saying all these rules. The brothers get sick of this and basically kill the father and then eat him in this totem feast. And then the brothers themselves then now start to institute all the rules. And this is this idea that the idea that you are, it's both a crime, but it's also the destructive foundation of the social order. So it's a very interesting read, but again, you have to read it and realize that there's not actually, savages, quote, who are doing this kind of thing. But the idea here is this is an elaboration, kind of a group elaboration of Freud's idea of the Oedipal complex. So that part of it, I think, has some traction. Later on, we have other Freudians coming in and talking about the incorporation of the other, especially in object relations, looking in early childhood development, where we mentally incorporate our relationships with other people, and that leads us to develop our emotional life and our personalities. And so this incorporation idea, symbolically, we go through this incorporation, we internalize stuff from our relationships, but sometimes that becomes, by either people or in groups, that becomes a literalized thing where you actually do it by ingesting people. And especially this is the idea of this would be that you see in funerary cannibalism. But also in symbolic form like the Christian Eucharist, etc. Okay, and then again, there's some if this doesn't happen properly, this internalization early life doesn't happen properly, that can lead to all sorts of interesting pathologies or kinks or everything in between. Again, we don't want to over medicalize or over pathologize things, but again, this early childhood period, according to object relations theorists, really kind of where our personalities get molded. And so not doing this internalization, if it doesn't happen properly, then we have different kinds of personality formations. And again, I've written a lot about that, so I have other books on that if you're interested. We go into a lot of detail about that. Okay. Art and cannibalism. A very interesting female psychoanalyst back in the 30s, and I would say she was probably one of the first feminist psychoanalysts, in my opinion, talked a lot about how artists incorporate external things in order to deal with internal issues going on. And then by taking stuff in, internalizing, incorporating it, they're able to sort of work it out psychologically and then externalize into some sort of form of art. And so she wrote a lot about that, really quite interesting. If, however, the external stuff is force-fed to the child, then this ends up becoming this concept of depositing that we've written about. And depositing is where the adults, the parents, the caregivers put something in the child's mind that the child can't properly digest, and this also causes problems later on. Okay, so this is this kind of symbolic version of cannibalism in a way. But I just thought I'd mention that because I thought her work is really interesting. And she's not very well known. And I like to actually really highlight the feminist psychoanalysts out there because there are a lot of them and they're really good. And some that actually taught here at UC Santa Cruz, Nancy Chodorow is a really good example of that. She's a fantastic psychoanalyst, written all sorts of great feminist literature, and she was actually taught here for a while. Okay, I talked about funerary cannibals already. Consuming the dead keeps them inside. You've taken in the essence of other people. It's a way of dealing with mourning. Monster cannibalism, you guys are going to get a lot of this week, so I won't have to talk about this, but zombies and vampires represent a form of cannibalism. Zombies, mindless aggression, you're consuming the rationality. I have a book chapter coming out on this now, anytime. From my talk from last year about zombies, turned into book chapter, so that's coming out. And vampires, of course, the idea of drinking blood is you internalizing vitality, passion. Okay. Now, I have a couple case studies. I don't have a lot of time left, but maybe I would mention really briefly a couple things. So this is a case of an actual German cannibal who consumed people, and I'll let you guys can read about this. It's kind of interesting. But I wanted to mention this film briefly, Cannibal Holocaust. And this is a very interesting film about cannibalism that demonstrates a lot of the things I've been talking about regarding cannibalism. I wanted to say there's a lot of interesting story behind this film, which I won't have time to get into, but I want to say this is not a film you want to watch. This is a film that has something that will offend everybody. I don't care, what your political beliefs are, what your sexual orientation is, what your religious beliefs or anything. This film will offend you. If the film doesn't offend you, then I'm worried that you might have a little psychopathy going on. It's a very, very offensive film. So do not go and watch the film. Okay, because you will be disgusted. There'll be lots of scenes, horrible scenes going on here. But symbolically, the film is very interesting. And I'll mention just a couple things really quick. You could take a postmodern reading of the film, the idea of you end up, who's the colonizers, who's being colonized, who's the colonizers, who are the bad people, who are the good people. The film kind of tricks you because you think initially it's the natives, and then later on, by the end of the film, that sort of flips, right? And we'll also talk a little bit about metamodernism, and I think Zechariah? Yeah, Zebediah is going to be speaking later. He'll be talking about metamodernism, and he spoke last year, a very interesting subject, a kind of evolution of postmodernism, but the idea that this film sits uncomfortably between both modernist views and postmodernist views, and the meta-modern views kind of in between, right? You're drawn into the film and confronted with your own complicity about watching it, and then you have this simultaneous experience of guilt, empathy, and horror, but you're emotionally engaged with it. So it's kind of in between these kind of things. At least I'll make the case for that. You could argue that probably, but I'll make the case for that. A queer reading of the film, if we look at the work of Judith Butler and Leo Bersani, we can see the film as a reflection of the breakdown of stable and heteronormative opposites, civilized versus savage, male versus female, pure versus polluted, self versus other, and how the camera's gaze appears neutral, but actually is an expression of power and control, okay? Especially by the normative society. And so one thing you can think of the film, in a way could be at least some of the characters in the movie could be seen as an abject version of a resistance to this sort of normative idea. And again, you can call on the work of Julia Kristeva on that, which is very interesting stuff. So I just mentioned that really quickly, and then I think I'll end there because I think we're out of time. But you can take a psychoanalytic view of the film, but it's a lot of the things I already discussed. So I think I'll just end there, and yeah. Good, thank you.
Good morning. Is it working? No? There we go. All right. So appetites, as Fabio Pericoli reminds us in Bite Me, are charged things, rich with very intense and complex emotional significance. He notes that people hunger for food and sex both, perhaps in the same way. Hunger and desire for incorporation and appropriation, together with sexual drives, he says, are arguably the origin of consumption in all its expressions. Consider the famous moment in When Harry Met Sally, the I'll have what she's having scene, where consumption and pleasure merge until the difference between appetite and arousal collapse. Food, sex, and power share a narrative language, a language of nourishment and consumption, of taking something else into the self in order to feel whole. When we speak of hunger, then, we are not only describing the body's need for food, but a longing to both consume and be consumed, a desire that feeds on intimacy. As Eve Sedgwick says, what counts as the sexual is variable and itself political. Desire, she says, is the glue that shapes relationships, even when that desire manifests as hostility, hatred, or violence. So let's examine then two texts which share some representations of consumption, power, and specifically queer desire manifest as violence. NBC's Hannibal is a reimagining of the character made famous in 1991's Silence of the Lambs. The show ran from 2013 to 2015 and centered on the titular Hannibal, played by Mads Mikkelsen, and the object of his obsession, FBI profiler Will Graham, played by Hugh Dancy. The other text is AMC's Interview with a Vampire, currently in production on season 3. While Anne Rice's original novel is fairly explicit about queerness, and the early cinematic adaptation was perhaps not quite Top Gun levels of homoerotic, the show is explicitly and centrally about the same-sex relationship between Louis, played by Jacob Anderson, and Lestat, played by Sam Reed. Both texts depict consumption and violence as inseparable from desire. Both use blood, flesh, and death as vehicles for intimacy. In both, feeding is never merely sustenance. It is communication, communion, and courtship. Every act of nourishment is also an act of incorporation, of abjection, a way of collapsing the difference between the self and the beloved. And both stage queerness not through tenderness, but through transformation and destruction. Hannibal and Interview with a Vampire present violence as a language for queer desire, specifically through 3 interrelated dynamics. Violence as an orchestrated mutual alienation, violence as flirtation and intimacy, and violence and consumption as a kind of apotheosis, a shared godlike becoming. Before I really dive in, though, I should clarify what this project is not. I'm not going to arbitrate judgments about whether such violent portrayals of queerness are positive or negative. I'm interested in how these portrayals work, how violence becomes a language for desire, and how that language subverts the norms of socially acceptable love. Leo Bersani, in Homos, critiques what he calls the rage for respectability in contemporary gay life. Rather than sanitizing queerness to fit social and communal norms as they are, Bersani invites us to consider an antisocial thesis about homosexuality. That queerness might afford us a massive redefining of relationality. Both Hannibal and Interview take that antisocial thesis literally, rendering love as an act of devouring, the ultimate refusal of polite assimilated intimacy. To love here is to consume, to make the other part of oneself, to collapse boundaries until nourishment and annihilation are the same gesture. Violence and consumption in these two texts follow a narrative trajectory that we've seen in media for decades and continue to reinforce the ways in which queer and queer-coded characters are portrayed. Do representations like these hearken to a legacy of villainy and violence as inherently queer? Of course they do. Is it relevant that both Hannibal and Lestat are white, urbane, educated, fashionable, wealthy Europeans, positioned opposite working-class Americans who they arguably corrupt and convert into their own contemptible lifestyle? Of course. Is the representation of the cannibal and the vampire as powerful, socially adept men who are also queer and parasitic something that warrants careful inspection in a contemporary landscape, fixated often violently on retrograde concepts of Western masculinity? Absolutely. Is it worth noticing the ways in which Lestat and Hannibal have feminized skill sets, cooking and fashion and party planning and crying at the opera? It's fascinating. Today, though, we discuss the ways in which these two texts present violence and consumption as a language for queer desire, both textually and subtextually. Violence as a mechanic for both mutual alienation and mutual transformation. So let's start then with that violence as a mechanism for orchestrated alienation. This is not a new trend in queer and queer-coded storytelling. In a media landscape governed by the Hays Code, which condemned any representation of queerness as sexually deviant, and a social and cultural climate in which same-sex relationships were at best spurned and at worst criminalized, being involved in a queer relationship meant that you and your partner shared a secret that carried with it the ever-present threat of mutual destruction. Any falling out or indiscreet conversation could be catastrophic. Consider the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. Which was the result of a personal feud between Wilde and the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde's lover, who famously described same-sex attraction as the love that dare not speak its name. Eventually, the state convicted Wilde of gross indecency and sentenced him to the years of hard labor, which would later kill him. In fiction, this dynamic, this violence as a mechanism for mutual alienation, is repeated again and again. We see it in 1934's The Black Cat, 1951's Strangers on a Train, 1999's The Talented Mr. Ripley, as well as myriad others. In each of these, as well as in Hannibal and Interview, the obsessed weaponizes violence against others in order to draw the object of their obsession into a web of mutual alienation, shared secrets, criminality, and skewed power dynamics, isolating them from others and restricting their freedom. In doing so, violence serves as a direct mechanism for queer intimacy. In these narratives, obsession weaponizes violence to forge intimacy through secrecy and complicity. The lovers are bound together by what they must conceal. In Hannibal and Interview, this pattern reemerges. Violence isolates the pairs from the world and binds them together in shared guilt, secrecy, and desire. In Hannibal, this begins immediately. In the pilot, Hannibal manipulates Will Graham into fatally shooting a serial killer, a moment that defines their relationship and Will's self-concept. He becomes, like Hannibal, a murderer. His intimacy with Hannibal is accelerated as Will confides in Hannibal as his psychiatrist, noting horrified that he liked killing. Later in season 1, when Will experiences worsening hallucinations and seeks medical explanations, Hannibal manipulates the test results and kills a surgeon in order to obfuscate Will's diagnosis, weaponizing their relationship in order to pull Will farther away from the life he knew and into a shared closeness with exclusively Hannibal. By the time Will engages in violences of his own design and begins hallucinating himself with antlers, mirroring his own monstrous imagining of Hannibal, he has fully adopted violence as a form of communication, a language that he and Hannibal share. Hannibal's courtship of Will takes the form of artful murder. For Hannibal, cooking is the highest form of intimacy. To prepare a meal is to translate emotion into flesh, to make feeling edible. The meals he shares with Will are more than grotesque jokes. They are sincere gestures of nourishment, of communion through consumption. As Kavita Finn and E.J. Nielsen note in Becoming, Hannibal, nearly every episode features potentially stomach-turning crime scenes alongside Food Network-worthy cooking sequences. Hannibal sends killers after Will like love letters. He sculpts corpses into polemics, and he plans elaborate dinner parties at which he feeds the Boston area elite the remains of his victims. He renders unintelligible the line between violence and art, and he does it on purpose. In the first episode of Interview, Louis is tormented by his mortal life, his business woes, his familial relationships, his increasing attraction to Lestat, and the suicide of his brother. When he seeks solace in the confessional, Lestat arrives and slaughters the priests there, pleading with Louis to shed the life he's led so far. They kiss on the church altar while the church burns in an unsubtle inverted wedding tableau, followed by the penetrative act of Lestat draining Louis's blood. Violence here is both conversion and consummation. Louis's transformation isolates him from his normal life. He can now be known only by Lestat, and Lestat only by him. Feeding becomes the medium through which love is both offered and received, a cyclical nourishment that binds them in a closed system of desire. Each drink from the other's body both sustains and endangers, a love that feeds and depletes in equal measure. We would be remiss, too, not to acknowledge the conversation the text is having about gay communities in the AIDS crisis, when systemic and state violences left HIV-positive men isolated and ostracized to deal with their illness on their own. Lestat and Louis's shared acts of violence, whether feeding on victims or one another, constitute intimacy in their relationship. Even Louis's early refusal to feed reads as sexual frustration. When Lestat offers him a victim, Louis looks on in horror and fascination. Instead of joining Lestat to feed, though, Louis turns, snatching a cat off of a nearby stoop and draining it of blood. There is something a little bit ham-fisted, if you'll forgive my crassness, about the formerly closeted Louis, whose fangs elongate as he watches a man prostrate on the ground before him, desperately turning away to eat pussy. Both Hannibal and Interview eroticize violence as flirtation as a way of signaling this recognition and knowledge of each other. In the second episode of season 3 of Hannibal, Hannibal creates an origami heart out of a person, a Valentine left for Will to find in the aftermath of what we as viewers recognize as a very messy breakup. The text does not dwell on the victim who became the tableau. Rather, the emotional resonance of the scene centers on the links to which Hannibal goes to express his desire. It's a violent display, but it doesn't strike a violent tone. Will and Hannibal date their way through victim after victim, sometimes quite blatantly. During one scene that can reasonably be described as a museum date, Hannibal observes, "If I saw you every day forever, Will, I would remember this time." These dichotomies, beauty and brutality, artistry and savagery, flirtation and abuse, sustenance and death, they all orbit the same paradox, that love, like hunger, both nourishes and consumes. The bloodshed that characterizes both couples comes from every side, from them at others, from them at each other, from them at themselves. These moments, though, are not portrayed in the text as tragic, nor are they indicative of a lack of feeling. Rather, they are framed as kinds of desire, blurring the lines between rivalry, hatred, adoration, and intimacy in ways that unsettle and intrigue audiences. But these acts are not one way. Hannibal and Lestat may see themselves as gods reshaping their companions, and indeed, as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen notes in his 7 Theses, vampires are already apotheosized monsters, but both Hannibal and Lestat are also changed in return. Their love incites a mutual metamorphosis. And offspring. Hannibal and Will act as surrogate dads to Abigail, whose birth requires Will killing her serial killer father. Louis and Lestat create Claudia, whose existence is both miracle and curse. These daughters of theirs literalize creation through violence. By the time Will and Hannibal are committing murders together, or Louis and Lestat are scandalizing the Mardi Gras ball with a kiss, violence and desire have become indistinguishable. When Will asks, "Is Hannibal in love with me?" Hannibal's psychiatrist answers, "Could he daily feel a stab of hunger for you and find nourishment at the very sight of you?" Yes. This line distills the entire erotic logic of both series. Hunger as affection, nourishment as devotion. In the finale of Hannibal, when Will and Hannibal kill together and then embrace at the edge of a cliff, Hannibal says, "See, this is all I ever wanted for you." Will replies, "It's beautiful." Showrunner Brian Fuller describes that moment as a culmination of sexual energy funneled into a physical act covered in bodily fluids. It is, as Fuller himself describes, pretty gay. Violence in these texts is not simply a metaphor. It's a language of appetite. It orchestrates intimacy through alienation, flirtation through destruction, and transcendence through consumption, a perverse kind of nourishment through which desire feeds on itself. In Hannibal and Interview, desire devours and makes its object. If, as Bersani suggests, queerness redefines relationality, then these stories imagine that redefinition as a kind of literal transformation, a love that can a love that consumes, reveals, and remakes until nothing is left but appetite. Thank you.
All right. We've been enjoying a very diverse panel, so that's been nice, linked by the cannibalism, and I will continue in that vein with the film Lowlifes. The 2024 Tubi original Lowlifes, that's right, the original film from Tubi. Written by Al Kaplan and directed by Tesh Gudakonda and Mitch Oliver, uses recognizable tropes from various horror films and subgenres to tell a tale of dread, cannibalism, torture, but it does so by subverting and even inverting audience expectations. Drawing most directly from Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Lowlifes brings two disparate families together in the rural backcountry with cataclysmic results. City folk versus rednecks, Christians versus cannibals, the brutally murdered versus a lone survivor. Yet, at the same time, the film interrogates both genre and audience, playing with slasher movie tradition and an established horizon of expectations, ultimately questioning the very definition of monster. Amy's double liminality within both families, human, cannibal, Christian, lesbian, codes her as monstrous. Yet she proves to be the only character able to survive. While Carol Clover's archetypal final girl has been updated over the years, Lowlifes suggests the existence of a final monster, and a cannibalistic lesbian one at that. Because the audience is intended to make unsubstantiated assumptions about the characters and overall plot based on advertised genre, narrative tropes, and decades of filmic stereotypes, Lowlifes functions as a postmodern horror film that exposes the fallacy of such assumptions, both within the universe of the film and without. The use of stereotypes makes Lowlifes a parody, for it functions at its best for those of the audience already familiar with the tropes of the slasher subgenre. Mark Blake explains how parody starts out with something in existence, that which we look on as stale, and works as a kind of circuit breaker, a resetting of the cultural dial. Lowlifes takes the stale stereotypes of the rural redneck family, innocent interlopers, blade-wielding slashers, cannibalism, and a plucky final girl, and resets the genre by challenging audiences' expectations. Most importantly, the film challenges our understanding of Clover's final girl, pushing the boundaries of both monster and survivor in a way that should leave viewers questioning their own cathartic desires. Lowlifes opens as one might expect. It's a dark night in a dark wood with a lone figure limping his way to the safety of a waiting vehicle. He's being stalked by a black-gloved shape wielding a wicked-looking hunting knife. After the ubiquitous throat slash and blood geyser, the title Lowlifes is revealed in horror movie Red, before the scene and tone shift to a sunny day, an RV cruising along a dirt road into the forest, and a jaunty pop song on the soundtrack. Viewers meet a clan of good guys. In this case, a wholesome family on vacation. Dad Keith is all smiles and enthusiasm as he grills steaks for lunch, along with his devoted wife Kathleen, his BMOC son Jeffrey, and his aloof daughter Amy. Apron-wearing Keith admonishes his youngest for using her cell phone and encourages her to eat, intoning what is clearly a family mantra: everyone has fun and everyone eats. Amy soon goes for a walk, allowing viewers a look at her as their potential final girl. According to Clover, the final girl is boyish, in a word. Just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine. As expected then, Amy is young, blonde, and pretty, but not too pretty, and not overtly feminine or sexualized, wearing an oversized leather jacket, t-shirt and pants. However, she hardly presents as all that masculine either. As Klaus Reiser emphasizes, the final girl more precisely lacks in traditional femininity. But Amy doesn't fulfill all the expectations of early final girls. She rebels against her father and his traditions, and she smokes a joint once she is alone. While Amy does present as liminal in that her sex and gender are ambiguous, she keeps texting her romantic partner with the gender-neutral name of Blair, and that she is a girl on the cusp of womanhood. Her incompatibility with Clover's and the audience's understanding of Final Girl will soon be explained. Lowlifes wastes little time in introducing viewers to the expected slashers as well. Like the final girl, those foes are liminal characters that represent hybridization, making the slasher figure a slippery one to categorize. As it was my understanding that the sighting of Jeffrey Jerome Cohen was a mandatory condition of this conference, I reference what he calls the harbinger of category crisis. Monsters are disturbing hybrids whose externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systematic structuration. While classic monsters manifest this hybridity in terms of physical form, slashers are ontologically liminal in terms of age, social class, religion, and gender. As Clover explains, the slasher killer is one propelled by psychosexual fury, more particularly a male in gender distress. As such, returning to Cohen, the monster is difference made flesh, a notable and essential difference that tends to be cultural, political, racial, economic, and, especially for the slasher, sexual. These definitions of monster inform the introduction of Lowlife's suspicious and potentially threatening characters. After establishing the excessive wholesomeness of the vacationing family, the film introduces two hillbilly cousins, Vern and Billy, driving an old beater pickup. The men are unkempt, dirty around the ears, and prone to spitting. They come across as rude, uneducated, and even threatening, clearly belonging to a different social class and way of life. Advised by her protective father, Amy retreats to the safety of the motorhome, followed by Vern's lascivious gaze, and he asks if he can go after her to check things out. Keith holds his ground, however, and the cousins back down, reluctantly driving off. And the family is clearly relieved by this close call with uncanny locals. The cousins resurface before long with their truck broken down, blocking the dirt road. Vern brandishes a shotgun to protect whatever is covered by a tarp in the truck bed, and he aggressively suggests the city folk give Billy a ride home. Once aboard the spacious RV, Billy emphasizes the economic disparity between the two worlds, suggesting he feels like a king. Things escalate as Jeffrey insults Billy's education by attempting a game of Mad Libs, and Bill's smarmy comments directed towards Amy mark him as a potential sexual threat. Billy describes his hillbilly family, narration accompanied by a montage of an isolated house, cobwebs on a window pane, a hand axe on a dubious countertop, and a woman firing a bow and arrow, all accompanied by ominous music. But he does invite Keith and his family to dinner, although the score makes the suggestion feel more like a threat than an act of kindness. At this point, Lowlifes takes a sudden twist, inverting the two families and jarring the audience because of their misguided assumptions. The diametric contrast of the threatening country bumpkins and the well-intentioned suburban family has been presented as a dyad of good and evil, one supported by film tradition, genre expectations, and audience assumptions. But the hillbilly family will soon be established as the unwarranted victims of the narrative, with the unassuming family as the true killers and threat. Lowlifes thus follows in the footsteps of postmodern horror films such as Eli Craig's Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, especially in terms of flipping the script on stereotypical redneck-based horror movies. But while Lowlifes is no The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's no Tucker and Dale either. Despite the visual similarity between Vern and Billy and Tucker and Dale, the lack of humor in Lowlifes proves it to be a parody, one that essentially uses the stereotypes embraced by its audience to challenge and even condemn their initial assumptions. Back in the RV, Billy recognizes his missing cousin Mellier's handwriting in Jeffrey's Mad Libs book, and the rehearsed facade collapses. Jeffrey suddenly stabs the feckless Billy in the neck, and the camera changes from his verisimilar perspective to an ominous fisheye lens. The world is askew, and everything viewers assumed about these people is clearly wrong. The low-angle shots and Jeffrey's maniacal facial expressions re-signal a horror movie, but not one the audience was expecting. When the camera cuts to a tight shot of Keith cutting Billy to pieces with a hacksaw, things become clear. This is not a family of victims, but a family that has normalized not only murder, but also cannibalism. Keith and Jeffrey are gung-ho to slaughter the entire family of God-fearing rednecks, and their bond over their bloodlust, with Jeffrey's black gloves revealing that he was, indeed, the murderer from the cold opening. The vacationing family next joins the rural family for dinner, but not in the way Billy had intended. They show up unexpected at the country home, much to the surprise of the kind old patriarch Neville and his two lovely granddaughters, Julianne and Savannah. While the former is all smiles, the latter seems suspicious. Even though Savannah is not presented from the outset as the main character of the film, as is typical of Clover's final girl, she is watchful to the point of paranoia. Indeed, she checks most of the traditional final girl boxes. Savannah has prepared the meal, establishing her as the family's maternal figure. She questions the visitors, wondering why Billy isn't with them. And she is revealed to be both bookish and talented. She has been accepted to a university for study, and she plays the piano. Furthermore, she is the most caring of her grandfather, tucking him in at night and mothering him. The rural family kindly invites their visitors to stay the night, and the audience feels dread for the hosts, not the guests. Amy continues to send mixed signals to the audience, mostly by way of her body language, yet her repeated reluctance to embrace her family's murderous pastime fully hardly makes her a good person. After dinner, she and Savannah bump into each other outside the bathroom, and they appear in a two-shot, almost like dueling final girls, or at least two potential final girls. But they are also presented like the protagonists of a romance, with furtive glances and awkward exchanges. They're clearly attracted to each other, establishing them both as liminal, but not liminal in terms of shared masculinity, but of shared lesbianism. They're also both liminal in terms of their respective families. Amy knows her father won't accept her sexuality, and Savannah is intelligent and talented. When the two are forced to share a bedroom, Amy and Savannah continue their archetypal dance. They bond over their unrealized dreams to get away, smoke some marijuana, and become increasingly intimate. Yet even audience expectations for a sex scene is inverted, not only because they defy heteronormativity, but also because they are two potential final girls. Amy almost comes across as a potential ally for Amy and a kind of co-final girl, but the allure of monstrosity proves too great. Manifesting the slasher's need to replace sexual desire with violence, Amy pulls out a knife with which to kill Savannah mid-foreplay, but she is accidentally frustrated when a stoned Savannah knocks Amy off the bed and onto her own phallic weapon. In addition to being an accomplished pianist, Savannah is also an award-winning archer, and she deploys her prowess in an attempt to turn the tables on the cannibals. Savannah expertly kills Kathleen with an arrow through the neck. Keith demonstrates little to no remorse, and he still has a helpless Julianne tied to a chair like a traditional female victim. Once again evoking the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but with the family's roles reversed, Keith tortures Julianne. Savannah has no choice but to give herself up, and Amy, now fully established as a slasher, disarms Savannah, subdues her, and ties her down. Things get particularly bleak as the sadistic Keith cuts Julianne's thumb off and eats it raw in front of her. Desperate, Savannah tells Keith that Amy is not a good Christian girl after all. She's a lesbian. A furious Keith condemns his daughter the way early slasher films condemned their female victims, perceiving her sexual identity and improprieties to be monstrous. The film comes to its expected climax with a savage showdown among the remaining survivors. Savannah frees herself and she stabs Keith in the eye with a fork before grappling with Amy. And this is the worst part. After Keith monstrously removes and then eats his own eyeball, Savannah is temporarily rescued at the last minute, as expected, by a man, Vern, with his Chekhovian shotgun. While Vern fights with Keith in the living room, Savannah fights Jeffrey in the kitchen, splashing him with boiling water before snapping his neck, all by herself, followed by a primordial scream. Julianne is able to free herself as well, and she dispatches Keith with a sledgehammer after he manages to stab Vern in the head. With these almost simultaneous moments of triumph of women defeating male attackers without any external assistance, the film seems to propose two final girls in the sisters. For the films following Halloween present final girls who not only fight back, but do so with ferocity and even kill the killer on their own without help from the outside. Unfortunately, however, Amy is also still alive. After the protracted familial showdowns, Amy kills Julianne, leaving just the two queer women to see things through to the end. As the stereotypes of the subgenre initially suggest, our newly crowned final girl Savannah gains the upper hand, and she chases Amy outside with a bloody sledgehammer. The outcome of this quasi-slasher seemingly assured. Unfortunately, Lowlifes has one more inversion for its audience. Because Amy runs out of the house, bloody, terrified, and threatened, with a shrieking Savannah in hot pursuit, the last-minute rescue by a male authority figure goes horribly wrong. Deputy White shoots Savannah in his failed Deus Ex Machina, saving the beleaguered blonde girl from L.A. instead. In other words, the slasher of Lowlifes becomes the film's literal final girl, being the last of the entire cast standing, especially after she kills Deputy White with, of course, a hunting knife. The narrative of Lowlifes comes full circle with Deputy White's death, as the audience's original erroneous assumption that Amy would become the film's final girl is proven to be, in fact, correct, but not in the way tradition would have presupposed. In this revisionist slasher film, Clover's final girl is killed by her male savior, and the last remaining slasher, a multiliminal murderer and cannibal, smokes a joint and becomes the true final girl of the film, or, perhaps more precisely, the final monster. This resolution makes some of Clover's early observations about the final girl new again. We are linked with the killer in the early part of the film. Our closeness to him wanes as our closeness to the final girl waxes. By the end, our point of view is hers. Indeed, Lowlifes begins by suturing us to Amy, and by the end, we remain close to her, for she is the sole survivor, a new kind of final subject for a new era. Thanks.
All right, we have plenty of time for questions. Sharon.
Medical cannibalism. Would that possibly include, and this is kind of icky, but the treatment for C. diff, which is ingestion of feces, kind of process, but, and then I thought about that, and it's like, well, poo consumption is another whole thing, which I'm intimately acquainted with because we keep reptiles that do that, because it's really, really good to establish the gut fauna. So I just, I know it's, and I'm just going to shut up now.
That's a very good observation. It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on, whether cannibalism would include, things that are eliminated from the body as opposed to integral body parts. So if you pick your nose, and eat your booger, are you a cannibal? But that's very interesting. And
Well, you mentioned the whole thing about if the, in one process is having the, it's seen as kind of a violation or treating your enemies with, disrespect because you shit them out, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what got me started thinking
yeah, that's
that
very
way.
interesting. And I would say, and again, I'm not an expert on medical cannibalism, but what little I've read is, my understanding is that if you could get a piece of a mummy that came from Egypt, and a lot of times these were counterfeited, they get some piece of meat, say this came from Egypt, but the more ancient it was, the more mojo it had because it came from a real mummy in Egypt. Supposedly the better the medicine, and so there's this idea that maybe you're also ingesting some past cultural, magic or some past, the past had some sort of, power to it, that's transmitted through the mummy, meat. So that's possible too. But yeah, it's a really interesting thought that you had. That's, make a good paper.
Kyle and Avalon, thank you so much for your presentations. It was so interesting to see them next to each other. I have never heard of Lowlifes, and you might have not seen it, but I was wondering, Avalon, if we could bring those two into conversation with each other, and what Kyle just described, the queer girls, Savannah and Amy, and what your thesis was about violence and sexuality and desire. I was just wondering if you have thoughts on Lowlifes in this context.
Well, the short answer is I haven't seen it. It does sound really interesting, though. I think the conversation about gender and queerness and violence in media is a fascinating one because queer sapphic representation is portrayed quite differently than queer masculine same-sex attraction, right? Not to suggest that any presentation of queerness is somehow gentler, but rather to suggest that the attraction and sexualization of the feminine is normalized in a patriarchal context. I think there's also something really interesting going on with spectatorship with same-sex masculine queer representation. I don't think you can really discuss Hannibal, an Interview with a Vampire, without thinking about fanfic and fan culture. Anne Rice had an infamous relationship with fanfic from her creations. And Brian Fuller, the showrunner for Hannibal, has explicitly acknowledged the relationship that the show has with fandom, and that's that most of the show's viewers are women, and most of the people writing fanfic about those two materials are also women. And so the interaction between spectatorship and violence in a place where, in those portrayed relationships, women are not the object, but they get to interact with violence and desire in a way that people who are socialized as feminine are intimately familiar with their whole lives, right? But they get to do so from a distance in a way that they can engage with, in a way that they perceive to be like psychologically safe. So that interaction between violence, desire, and gender, I think, is fascinating.
First up, yeah, thank you, Avalon. You set up things for me so well and so expertly, because of course the source texts for both of yours pave the way for the antagonist protagonist, which is what Lowlifes is playing around with. I just wanted to clarify that in Lowlifes' attempts to use stereotypes to criticize stereotypes, it is not a progressive text. But I need to emphasize that a little bit more in the revision, because its portrayal of queerness is deeply troubling. Because it's trying to say, look, just because you're gay doesn't mean you're a monster, but yeah, you are. So it attempts some very interesting things and opens up a good conversation, but ultimately it fails in ways that Hannibal and Interview are doing with much more sophistication. And so I'm stepping a little bit outside my comfort zone to pursue this project, but I think it raises questions, even if it is flawed in its effort.
Thank you guys for your wonderful presentations. My question is maybe for both Avalon and Kevin. I was interested in like the major number of parallels that you pointed out between the representations of like consumption and nourishment in Hannibal and in Interview. But I'm wondering if you make a distinction between the ways that like human flesh eating and vampiric blood sucking serve as nourishment in these shows, or if you feel like they're being like equivalized as symbols. And for Kevin, I guess I'd translate that question as like, in terms of the anthropological history of cannibalism, do we make a distinction between people who are believed to like drink blood and eat flesh? Or is that incorporation of dead human into living human always seen as equivalent?
You want to go first?
No.
Okay. I would say, and I think somebody maybe last year talked about this, but, with regard to vampires, blood drinking, my work on zombies is, and I have a book chapter come out in a book on unthinking, and the idea that zombies symbolically consume rationality. So they like brains, right? They're trying to get brains usually, right? They consume rationality. And vampires, the idea is that they consume passion. And then so if you look at it, from a psychopathological point of view, vampires, typically have a characteristic of narcissism. They tend to be very, and again, Lestat's a really good example of a narcissistic vampire. Not all the vampires in Anne Rice universe are narcissistic, but Lestat certainly fits the bill. And the idea is they can't really feel true love, and so they have to ingest it from others. They have to ingest the passion from others. And so that's a typical trope. And I think somebody maybe last year talked about the vampire thing. But that's I would say. I would say that what Avalon was talking about, love and consumption, being, connected. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that was a really good statement, and it makes also a lot of sense from a Freudian point of view. We would say the same thing.
Thank you. I don't know that I have a terribly concise or descript response, but I think about in Hannibal the rendering of people into meat in sort of tender as the flesh avenues is a way of establishing for Hannibal superiority, right? That he considers the people he consumes to be inferior to him. He considers them to be livestock in a way, the prey that he hunts and consumes. He doesn't think about them as people. Lestat certainly does not think of his victims as people, right? He specifically targets, in some cases, the people who misrepresent art he really enjoys, right? That he considers himself to be editing the populace. And so I think there's definitely some superiority complexes going on there. But there's something I think about blood drinking specifically that is interacting with both the idea of bloodborne pathogen and with the idea of equivalency in stature, right? That people have blood, they can lose blood and make more blood and be fine. that's much harder to do with the meat parts. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah, I think maybe sort of building on that question and building on the responses. I'm wondering about kind of how cannibalism draws the lines of the human. Just going back to the sort of definitions of cannibalism that requires some sort of identification, right, between the consumer and the consumed, but also, or at least in the case of exo-cannibalism, some sort of differentiation, some sort of drawing of lines, with kind of, we could say, monstrous cannibalism, like, when we have a zombie or a vampire that is sort of differentiated from a human versus, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre situation where they are humans, but maybe they're otherized in other ways. So it's a question for her and anyone who wants to pick it up or riff on it. But I am just curious about that sort of how cannibalism as categorization of the human.
One of the things that we get with varying degrees about the stuff that we've talked about is the normalizing of cannibalism, where cannibalism used to be one of the ultimate societal taboos up with incest, that there is this kind of cultural fascination with it, and I don't know if it's newfound in any way, or if there's some kind of resurgence in the interest, particularly in pop culture. But it does kind of ask those questions. So when you look back at Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the family is presented in such monstrous exaggeration. We're wearing skin, we're cutting ourselves, Grandpa's old, really old. And so it's almost like, well, yes, they would be cannibals because look how othered they are. Whereas what we're getting with a character like Hannibal or with this family in Lowlifes is, look, they're respectable and they're educated and they're normal and it's just a thing they do. And so I think it's really kind of pushing our understanding of the taboos. But it's so problematic to me because there's some things that used to be taboo that never should have been, that we're now finally coming to accept. But is this one of them? I'd prefer not, but I'm old, so I'm old-fashioned. We have the youth answer that one.
I think I'd refer you back to David, who spoke last night, in his work on dehumanization. And I think that's part of the projection. We project onto the other, this non-human aspect or less than human aspect. And I think what's really interesting to me a little bit from what Kyle was talking about, his examples and my example of the Cannibal Holocaust film, is that you have this reversal. There's this reversal that we look at it, you're watching it, you assume the rednecks are going to be the cannibals, and then there's this reversal. And that's the same thing in Cannibal Holocaust. It's the same reversal going on there. And I would say that's a big part. Now, as far as, whether cannibalism becomes accepted or not, maybe 10, 20 years ago, there was an anthropologist who tried to bring to market a synthetic human meat called humofu. It was going to be like a kind of a tofu. And this was going to be so he could introduce his classes, his anthropology classes, to, what it was like to eat human flesh. And I tried to find it because I was going to serve it to my class one day and see if people would eat it, and say this is, and then tell them, oh, by the way, this is just tofu. And I realized I'd get in trouble for that, and it never got brought to market. I did think about trying to make my own and then do a little experiment, and again, realized I would get in a lot of trouble for that, but who knows? Maybe if it's in the form of vegan tofu, like when it'll be acceptable.
I mean, did you have something to add? Mine wasn't important. Go ahead.
It seems that in all the texts referred to and in all of your presentations, there are social class dimensions to cannibalism. And I'm kind of curious as if any of you have any ideas about directions for where that leads us in terms of exploring cannibalism.
That was what I was just thinking about with Texas Chainsaw and Hannibal, right? That Texas Chainsaw is very much about a family that is economically disadvantaged and has been like consumed by the industry in their town that is currently failing, right? Hannibal is the wealthy elite consuming people he deems less than. But there's also a broader conversation about like the consumption of the self by the state. And those social class elements of narratives about cannibalism are important fundamentally, I think, to the genre. I'm thinking again about Tender is the Flesh, which wasn't part of my presentation, but is about, bless you, the industrialization of human meat, and the ways in which like people are bred to be consumed and their vocal cords are cut so that they can't speak and they are rendered like cattle. And so I think in a global capitalist culture where all of us are commodified, the literalization of the consumption of our bodies is just an extension of that conversation.
I mean, I would maybe expand on that, and excuse me for maybe being slightly political, but you think about the billionaire class, a few individuals owning more wealth than 50% of the population of the United States. I mean, that is a form of cannibalism. The masses are being cannibalized by a few, who do not need this meat, capitalistic meat for nourishment. They just need it because they have some desire to, incorporate and control everyone. So I think that's something maybe as a society, we're experiencing now.
Panda, I wonder if you could maybe talk about the class question in relation to the Army Hammer scandal, because it feels like class and the fact that he is so wealthy and, that's just so much a part of maybe the delight in witnessing that you were also talking about.
Sure. Again, my brother, who's a reality show Hollywood producer, he advised me that the most popular reality shows are rich people behaving badly because we love to see them suffer, because I may have concerns about paying my debts, but at least I don't have to live that life. And this House of Hammer was interesting because the aunt comes out with this, saying the poor little rich girl, and I suffered too, do I not bleed? So there's this interesting reversal there. So again, can we find it in our hearts to feel bad for the obscenely wealthy? And we want to see them get their comeuppance. We want to see them, we want Armie Hammer to go to rehab, and he did. And, we want them to pay the price. So again, I think my last slide I said, where does justice blur the lines to voyeurism?
We have time for maybe one more question, if there is one more.
I was just going to say it was kind of interesting that you suggested that because that cannibalism might be coming into the fore because it's been portrayed as being done by these kind of rich, wealthy, sort of more socially acceptable people. But I feel like that's always kind of been the case with vampires or other cool monsters, where they're revered in some way but still monstrous-sized. So but still nobody's going around sucking blood. You know what I mean? Like, it's not come into the fore. I mean, hopefully. So I'm wondering if you think that's still, like that. I mean, maybe cannibalism is more more easily, people could do it easier than sucking blood and becoming immortal, but I still don't hope that it means it's coming into fashion.
Well, I mean, it all goes back to Anne Rice. She's really the one who tipped the scales over, which is so important for her. But there is some blood consumption for some, and of course, I think you said that blood replenishes, so it's not like taking a bite out of someone's arm. But I think there is a subculture that involves blood drinking. I don't know anything about it. And so I could see that going interesting directions. But what I was thinking about earlier, and now I can't remember the name of the film, sorry, I'm terrible. There's a movie about a company that clones celebrity cells into food. And so you can spend exorbitant amounts of money to eat your favorite celebrities, and it's excused because it's a cloning process. So could we see a somewhat dystopic future where we're using cloning ability to produce food rather than life-saving organs? And would that be exploited by the capitalist system? Well, of course it would. But it does raise some disturbing questions about what might be permissible through science. But I can't even really think about it. I don't want to go there.
I'll be quick, I promise. But if we look at sort of the narrative lineage of the vampire from its earliest iterations, and at least Western lit, the vampire tends to be very centrally about empire. Right? It's about the fear of the powerful foreigner, or in many cases, bizarrely, the powerful Confederate. And that internal Americanized fear of, not just Americanized, that internalized Western fear of external takeover, of like the depletion of resource in the same way that empire depletes resource elsewhere. I think that's very central to the monster as a type.
And I'll just add that, as we're vampires may be these elitist, empire representations, zombies are the proletariat, right? And so, if you see the last George Romero movie, in his series, I can't remember the title of it, but it's very good. The zombies are clearly the proletariat, and the elite, rich people are clearly the bad guys. And at the end, there's this group in the middle that fight the zombies. They're kind of like the middle class, right? And in the end, they have a chance to kill all the zombies, and they're kind of like, yeah, we're just going to let them go. The zombies are becoming conscious, and so there's a clear class distinction message there with the zombies. So I just want to mention that.
All right, let's thank our wonderful first panel.
Thank you guys.